Hi folks, welcome to this video on joints and movements, part of the movement analysis section of the course. What I'd say is, before you start flapping and things like that, this video is aimed at the key things you need to know. So I'm not going to cover everything that's in the textbooks. I'm going to cover the key things that we need to know, that we need to be able to analyse in terms of the exam. Okay, so in terms of joints and movements, we're obviously talking about the skeletal system, and we're going to talk about the key joints in the body, those being the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, the hip, the knee and the ankle. We're not going to look, and you don't need to know about any other joints, because those are the 6 key joints involved in the bulk of our sporting movements. If we were going to get careers as physiotherapists, personal trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, we need to know about these joints because they're the ones that produce the bulk of our sporting movements. So we're going to look at each one of these joints in turn and analyse it in terms of the type of joint, the articulating bones, the movements that you can get at these joints and the planes in which they take place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top of the body and then work my way down. So the highest joint up we need to know about is the shoulder joint, as we've seen there. Should you get asked anything about articulating bones, that is simply which bones make up the joint. Now, I'm going to write it down in a minute, but you should know that this is a ball and socket joint. There is the ball shape there, and there is the socket it fits into. The ball is made by the top or the head of the humerus, and the socket is made by the scapula. Yes, this is the acromion, this is the glenoid cavity, fantastic, but the key things that you need to know is humerus and scapula. They make up, they are the articulating bones of the shoulder joint. So I've just added that bit in there. Now, because ball and socket joint is a certain type of joint classification, let's look at the movements that you can get out of this ball and socket joint. Now, as you'll already know from your own shoulder joint, you've got a huge amount of movement at that joint because of the shape of that joint. The ball fits into the socket, and that allows us to get all different types of movements. Now, what we've got here is obviously the person standing side on. If you raise your humerus in front of your body, lifting it upwards, but as you can see there, the dotted line is representing the arm was behind. Now it's moving forwards, and I remember forwards as flexion. Okay? Now you can see there's the dotted line, there's where the arm was. The arm is now moving backwards, so that is extension. So every time you raise your full arm in front of your body, you have flexed your shoulder joint. Every time you move your full arm behind your body, you have extended or are extending your shoulder joint. Ones that are fairly common sense are these two, abduction and adduction. I know it's not a nice thing to say, but if you abduct someone or if someone is abducted, they are taken away. So this time the person is standing face on, and they are raising their arms away from the middle of the body, the torso. So if you are taking the arm away from the torso, you are abducting the shoulder joint. Adduction, A-double-D, you are adding the arm back to your body. If you want to think of it that way, you are adding it back towards the torso. So abduction is moving the shoulder away from the torso, the midline of the body. Adduction is moving it back towards that midline, back towards the torso. These ones are a little bit hard to picture on the stick diagram, but you know they are good diagrams. They're not mine. I'm not going to take the credit for them. What you've got here is, again, this person is facing you. This diagram here, they are facing you. Now, if you think about it, if you was to stand there with your elbow flexed like it is and your palm facing upwards, so imagine this person's palm is facing upwards, and you were to rotate your arm out to your side, that is lateral rotation. Okay, lateral means to the outside. So they have rotated their arm to the outside, again, away from their body. They haven't taken it away, they have rotated it away from their midline. And medial rotation, again, this time you've got the arm with your palm facing upwards, and you are going to rotate it back across your body. So medially back towards the middle of your body. So these are terms that you should be familiar with from your classes. And finally, a couple of unique ones here. What we're doing here is we are looking down. This is the head of the person. We are looking down on top of their head. Now, although it's not clear from this diagram, I might just try and add something here to try and make it a little bit clearer. I don't know what I'm going to add though. What is happening here is if I do a little line here, that's their massive nose. That line is their massive nose sticking forwards. So what is horizontal flexion? Well, if you remember what flexion was, it was bringing the arm forwards in front of the body. So, as I said, there was the dotted line behind. It's moving forwards, it's flexed. What they've done here is looking down on top of this person's head. Their arm was behind them, but sticking out. Okay, they've raised their arm up. Okay, and what they've done now is they have now brought the arm across their body. They have brought the arm in front of their body, but in a horizontal position, and that is known as horizontal flexion. A common one there is tennis. Okay, think about when someone does a forehand racket shot in tennis. They swing their arm behind them to play the shot, and then they swing their arm through to strike the tennis ball. That would be an example of horizontal flexion. Horizontal extension is the exact opposite. It's taking the arm back behind you again. So, sticking with the tennis example, you will horizontally extend your shoulder joint on the back swing and getting ready for the shot, and then you will horizontally flex your shoulder when you actually strike the ball, when you actually play the shot. Now, the one we've got at the end here is circumduction. Now, this is doing big arm circles, swinging your arms, doing big arm circles by your side. This is often seen as a bit of a cop-out, because what actually is circumduction is a combination of all these movements. Okay, what do you do when you are circumducting your shoulder joint? You're flexing it, you're flexing it, you're flexing it, you're flexing it. Then as the arm goes behind you, you're extending it. It incorporates abduction and adduction and a bit of medial lateral rotation. So actually circumduction is just a combination of all of these movements together. So moving on to the elbow joint then. There are only three bones that make up this joint. We have got the humerus, the big bone in the upper arm. Obviously at the top end up here, that's what makes the shoulder joint. But obviously the bottom end of the humerus makes up the elbow joint. We've got your radius and your ulna. Your radius is the bone that is on the thumb side of your forearm, and the ulna is the bone that is on the little finger side of your forearm. Now, this is a different type of joint. This is a hinge joint. So there's your joint classification. There are your articulating bones. Now, because this is a hinge joint, it has its own range of movements, different to a ball and socket joint. And fairly straightforward with this and relatively quick. There are only two movements possible really at a hinge joint, and they are flexion and extension. Yes, there are pronation and supination which technically take place at the elbow joint due to the pivot joint nature. So some of you may be reading in the textbooks, hang on, I thought the elbow joint was a pivot joint. This bit of the ulna creates a pivot joint. So if you was to flex your elbow, hold your elbow in this position here and rotate your wrist palm facing upwards and palm facing outwards, and even I've done it, I've said rotating your wrist, you're not actually moving the wrist, you're actually moving the ulna and the radius there, rotating on top of each other. But in terms of sports movements, in terms of the big movements, what we're interested in is the actual hinge joint nature of this elbow joint. When the elbow joint flexes, it bends, and when the elbow joint extends, it straightens. So they're the two key movements we're really interested in terms of the elbow joint. So moving on to the final upper limb joint that we're interested in, the wrist joint. Now, as you can see from this diagram here, there are many different bones that make up that aspect of the wrist called the carpal bones. You've got your scaphoid in there as well as many others. That's the most common one that just sits underneath the thumb. But the carpal bones, you might have heard someone's got carpal tunnel syndrome and things like that. These are all the carpal bones here. And then the radius and ulna, like we've just seen, that the bottom ends of these make up the elbow joint, and the distal, the far ends of these bones make up the wrist joint as well. Now, this is a different kind of joint. We've got a ball and socket so far, a hinge. This is a condyloid joint. Now, again, because it's a different kind of joint, a condyloid, that's its joint classification. It means we get certain movements and we don't get others. Now, some of you might be saying in the video, I thought the wrist joint could do other things. Well, it can do a few other things. These are the ones that we're interested in terms of sports movements, in terms of throwing, catching, batting, striking, dribbling a basketball, things like that. The main movements are flexion, as we can see here. So bending the wrist joint, just as you bent the elbow, that was a flexion. Extension, as you can see, not necessarily straightening, but it's a bit like the shoulder in this respect, moving the wrist joint backwards, okay? And then what we've got is These are sometimes known in some textbooks as radial ulnar deviation. So if you remember, the radius is on the thumb side, okay? So if I am abducting, I am deviating towards the radius. It's abduction. Just think of it this way. What did we say was abduction and adduction? Abduction is taking something away from the body. Adduction is adding it. If you were to stand there, facing forwards with your arms straight by your side, but your palms facing forwards, if you are to move your hand so your thumb raises upwards, you have abducted your wrist joint. You are taking it away from your body. If you then bring it back so your little finger is moving back towards your body, you have adducted that wrist joint. You have brought it back to the midline of the body. So the two main movements we get at the wrist joints are obviously flexion, extension, but there are some sporting movements where we are going to get abduction and adduction. Okay? So moving on to the lower limb now, the first joint that we're going to look at is the hip joint. Again, it's a ball and socket, as you can see. So we're going to get exactly the same movements at this joint as we got at the shoulder joint, because they are both the same joint classification. That's the point of joint classifications, to classify which movements you can get. We've got a ball and socket. As you can see this time, that ball is made by the femur, and the socket, yes, the entire thing is called a pelvis, but as you can see, the pelvis is split into three parts: the ilium, the ischium or ischium, and the pubis. Okay, the ischium or the ischium, that's the bony part of your bum when you sit down. That's the bony part there. You've got one in each bum cheek. Your pubis, exactly what you'd expect it to be, around the pubic area, the bony part at the front. And the ilium, they're the bits when people are talking about the love handles and things like that. Yes, it's not the meat, the fat, the muscle tissue that sits on there, but it's the big bony cresty bones that they attach to. It's the ilium that makes up the socket. So don't worry too much about pubis and ischium or ischium. When we're talking about the ball and socket joint of the hip joint, the articulating bones are the femur and the ilium. As I'm sure you can see as well, even though we're going to get the same types of movements at the hip joint, we don't get the same range. You know, that socket is a lot deeper, and that ball is much more embedded into that socket than the shoulder joint, which means it's a lot more stable than the shoulder joint, hence why you have a lot of people dislocating shoulders, but not many people dislocate hips. It does still happen, but nowhere near as many. But because it's more stable, we don't get the exact same range of movement, but we do get the exact same types of movements. So you can see the similarity here between the shoulder joint and the hip joint. Again, look what's happening. When that joint is moving forwards, just as the arm moving forwards was shoulder flexion, the entire arm, as the entire leg moved forwards, that is hip flexion. The way I remember it, there's the femur forwards flexion, FFF. Okay, so that's an easy way to remember it. As that leg moves backwards, the entire leg, the hip joint is extended. Again, as you can see, there's the midline of the body. As that leg moves out to the side, we have abducted the hip joint. Because remember, even though the knee is moving and the ankle is moving, the movement is being generated at this joint all the time. As we bring that leg back, they've crossed the leg here, but equally just moving that leg from an outwards position back to straight in front, that is adduction. We are adding the joint, or we are adding the leg back to the body again. And they've put it on this one as external and internal rotation. We're going to stick with medial and lateral rotation. As you can see, what the person has done here is they have rotated their entire leg, so their foot is now facing outwards. That would be, they've classified it as external. That is a lateral rotation. I've laterally moved my foot to the outside of my body. And this time, look, they've turned the foot in towards the middle or the medial of the body, and that is medial rotation. Okay, so they're the key joints, all the exact same ones that we had at the shoulder joint. Sorry, you might go to circumduction. Same rule applies. You can do circumduction of the hip, but it's simply those movements acting in a certain movement pattern that leads to circumduction. So penultimate joint, then the knee joint. Okay, again, it's a hinge joint. There was similarities between the upper and the lower body. I think, if I may be wrong, but I'm thinking it stems back from the days when we used to be creatures that crawled on all fours. So we needed ball and socket joints at what are now our shoulders and our hips. And then we've got hinge joints at the elbows, or what are now our elbows, and also at the knees. So again, we're going to see exactly the same movement patterns. So what we've got here is we've got the bones that articulate, again the bones that make up the knee joint. We have got the femur here, we've got the tibia here, we've also got the patella that floats in front of that kneecap. As you can see here, you've got all your ligaments, your anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments. You've got very important cartilage in there. The patella, one of its jobs is to protect that knee joint space there. The other bone named on here is the fibula. Do not put that down as an answer in terms of articulating bones at the knee joints. As you can see, that fibula starts there. That is the knee joint. The fibula is about half an inch, maybe a little bit more below that knee joint. It does not articulate at the knee joint. It is not one of the bones that moves against another bone as the knee moves. So should you ever get asked about articulating bones at the knee joint, femur and tibia, stick with those. Because as you can see there, look, articulate means to move against. That femur, there's the bottom of it, is going to move against that tibia. There's the top of it. The patella is going to float across the two. So you could argue that patella is a potential answer there. They might give it, they might not. But that fibula, the top of that is not moving at all as the knee joint moves. It's not articulating with another bone. So just stick with femur and tibia. And just as the elbow joint was really straightforward, flexion extension, because that was a hinge joint, the knee is also a hinge joint, so it just flexes and extends as well. And as you can see from this very basic diagram, there it is flexing, i.e. it's bending, and there it is extending. So the classic one there is you are going to extend that knee joint when you are kicking a ball. You're going to extend to strike through the ball. You are going to flex that knee joint during running actions. Every time you flex your hip to get to the top, the knee will flex ready to strike back down again to become the drive leg. But anytime you bend that knee joint, you have flexed it. Every time you have straightened that knee joint, you have extended it. So finally then, the ankle joint. There are three bones that we need to know here in terms of articulating bones. There's the tibia, your shin bone. There's the fibula, okay? And there's something called the talus or the talus. That's the one that we're interested in. The calcaneus is your heel bone. These naviculars, cuneiforms, cuboids, they all make up your tarsals, your metatarsals here, and then your phalanges. But remember, we're interested in the ankle joint. So it's those three that make up the ankle joint, the fibula, the tibia, and the talus or the talus. Your outside ball of your ankle is that thing there, so it is the bottom of your fibula. Although you can't see it on this diagram, the inside ball of your ankle is your tibia. And then the talus or the talus fits in the notch in between the two of them. So when you're rocking your ankle forwards and backwards, which we'll discuss in a second, that talus or talus is rocking in the gap formed between the fibula and the tibia. Now let's go with what's acceptable in terms of marks in the exam. Let's not overcomplicate things. Some textbooks will say the ankle is a gliding joint and a combination of this and everything else. What you'll get a mark for saying is the ankle joint is a hinge joint. So there are only three types of joint classification we need to know. Ball and socket, hinge and condyloid. Shoulder and hip are ball and socket. The elbow, the knee and the ankle are hinge, and the wrist is condyloid. So they're the only three joint classifications we need to know in terms of the exam. And the bones that make up this hinge joint, as we've said, are the fibula, the tibia and the talus. Don't make up bones. Don't put fibia and tibula. There's no such thing. You won't get marks for it. Fibula, tibia and talus or talus. Now, because it's a hinge joint, as with the knee and the ankle, the knee and the elbow, there are only two key movements. Yes, there are more movements available at the ankle, but there are two key ones that we need to know in terms of sports success, and they are these two: plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. It's one of those things. We've had hinge joints, as we said, at the knee and the elbow, and it's just been flexion extension. Why do we have to have two new names? I don't know, but we do need to know them. Easy ways to remember it. Plantar flexion is point your toes. Ignore these numbers, ignore this. Just look at the position of the foot. When you plantar flex, P, you point your toes. So every time you go up onto your tiptoes, or maybe you point your toes to strike a ball with your laces, you have plantar flexed your ankle joint. Dorsiflexion, I remember it as D, to draw your foot back. Draw it back towards your shin, towards your tibia. Instead of pointing the toes, we've drawn the toes back towards the shin. That is dorsiflexion. Okay, so they're the key movements available at all the joints. Now I'm going to recap all these movements in another video linked with the muscles that create those movements. So we'll do a recap, but this video is just about which movements are available at which joints, the classifications, the articulating bones, and this final part that often throws people off, to do with planes. Planes of movement in which we move and the movements associated with each plane. Now here's a diagram showing planes and axes. Don't panic, axes are no longer on the syllabus, right? So if any of your teachers are mentioning that, it used to be on the syllabus, axes, but now we're just interested in the planes of movement. Now what do we mean by planes of movement? Look at this lady here. Imagine she's been cut in half, separating her left-hand side of her body from the right-hand side of her body. That is called the sagittal plane. If she were to step forwards or swing her arms forwards or her legs forwards, or take a step backwards or swing her arms and legs backwards, she would be moving in her sagittal plane. In this picture here, the frontal plane, she is now separated the front side of her body from the back side of her body. So if she was to raise her arms up to the side or her legs up to the side or bring them back towards the midline of the body, she would be moving in her frontal plane. If she was to do side steps or a cartwheel, she would be moving in the frontal plane. Finally, we've got the horizontal plane, and this separates the top half of your body from the bottom half of your body. So any kind of rotation or twisting movements take place in the horizontal plane. Now straight away some of you might be already figuring this out, going, right, I reckon I know which movements take place in which plane. Well, let's finish off with that now. Let's make sure we know them. So, sagittal plane. Movements that take place in the sagittal plane are flexion and extension movements, including plantar and dorsiflexion. So if this lady flexes her, oops, I'll just move that picture back there, sorry, got the wrong thing on. If this lady flexes her shoulder joint or extends it, flexes her hip joint or extends it, flexes her knee or extends it, flexes her wrist or extends it, plantar flexes or dorsiflexes her ankle, they have all taken place in the sagittal plane. Frontal plane then, as you'd expect, remember, any movement that takes place in this area here, abductions of the shoulder joint, of the hip joint, also abduction of the wrist joint, moving that thumb upwards, and then adductions, bringing those joints back towards the midline of the body. They're all movements that take place in the frontal plane. And finally then, just clarify something as well, I've just noticed, on this diagram here it says horizontal plane, then it says transverse plane. They are the same thing. Horizontal or transverse plane, use whichever, it's going to get you the mark. They're all your medial and lateral rotations. So if this lady here, remember the skeleton diagram where they twisted their foot so it was facing outwards, that is lateral rotation, and then they twisted their foot so it was facing back inwards, again, medial rotation. These are all horizontal plane movements, same here. Just to clarify on that point, because it might not have been clear in the way that I described it. If I was to draw a line, drawing a line with my hand. If I was to draw a line down that lady's arm there, okay, if she were to rotate that arm so that line was facing the outside away from her body, that would be lateral rotation. If she were to then rotate it so that line was pushed up against their body, that would be medial rotation. So any kind of rotation movement is on the transverse or the horizontal plane. Any kind of abduction or adduction at any joint is on the frontal plane, and any type of flexion or extension, including plantar and dorsiflexion, is on the sagittal plane. Hopefully you found this video useful, folks. Like I said, there's going to be a follow-up video to do with the muscles that create these movements, the agonist, the antagonist, etc., etc. Good luck with it.